The floor of the transport shuttle was slick with something warm, and I did not want to look down to find out what it was. Alarms screamed in 3 different alien languages, and none of them mattered because the meaning was the same in every tongue. We were under attack, and I was losing. My name is Cale Dunmore, and 6 months ago I was hired to protect a woman who was never supposed to need protecting. Princess Valoran of the Ithkari royal house, daughter of King Soravan. A woman with silver eyes and a voice that could calm a room full of armed soldiers without raising itself once. I was her bodyguard. Today, I was about to become the man who failed her. The convoy had been moving through a quiet trade corridor. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have gone wrong. Then the escort ships stopped answering hails. Then the lights went out. Then the boarding pods hit the hull like hail on a tin roof, and men who were not supposed to exist inside a royal convoy started cutting through bulkheads like they had a map memorized in their sleep. Someone on the inside had sold us out. I knew that before I even saw the first attacker's face, because no outside force gets past Ithkari shielding without help. Someone with access, someone with clearance, someone who smiled at the princess during court dinners and called her cousin or friend. I pulled Valoran behind me the moment the first shot cracked through the corridor. She did not scream. She never screamed, not once in the 6 months I had guarded her, and that silence had always told me more about her strength than any speech she ever gave in the royal court. But this time, when I looked at her, I saw something new in her eyes. Fear, not for herself, for me. "Do not do this," she said, her hand gripping my arm. "Cale, do not. I am doing my job," I told her, and I meant it, though the job had stopped being just a job, somewhere around month 3, somewhere between long nights on watch and quiet conversations about homeworlds and what freedom meant to people who had never known captivity. The attackers came in a wave, and I put myself in the doorway because that doorway was the only thing standing between them and her. I do not remember every hit I took. I remember the sound of my own ribs cracking against a wall. I remember shouting at her to run, and for once she listened to me, though I could hear her voice breaking as she said my name over the comm before it cut to static. The last thing I saw clearly was a masked figure standing over me, checking my pulse with the casual disinterest of someone confirming a shipment count. He said something to another figure in a language I did not recognize, and the words that followed, translated later by people who owed me favors, chilled me more than any physical wound ever could. "Leave the human. He is not worth the cargo space. The princess is the only prize that matters." Then there was nothing, just darkness and cold and the distant sound of engines pulling away with the only person I had sworn to protect still on board. I woke up in a scrapyard station on the edge of nowhere, a place where ships went to die and men went to disappear. A junk trader named Owen Marsh had found me half buried in wreckage debris, barely breathing, and for reasons I still do not fully understand, he decided I was worth saving rather than looting. He told me later that I had been unconscious for 11 days. 11 days while the galaxy kept moving without me, while the trail of the woman I had failed to protect grew colder with every passing hour. The first thing I did when I could stand without the room spinning was find a data terminal and search for any news of the royal convoy attack. What I found made my stomach turn in a way that had nothing to do with my injuries. The Ithkari royal house had gone silent, no official statement, no search effort announced, no military response, just silence. The kind of silence that only happens when the people in power already know something they do not want the public to learn. I dug deeper, calling in every contact I had left, spending currency I did not have on information brokers who dealt in secrets nobody was supposed to sell. It took weeks, but eventually the picture became clear, and it was worse than I imagined. Princess Valoran had not been kidnapped for ransom. She had been sold, auctioned off through an underground network that dealt in rare and valuable captives, purchased by a warlord who ruled 3 sectors of contested space with an iron grip and a reputation for cruelty that made even hardened criminals speak his name in a whisper. His name was Gorath Vex. And the reason the royal house stayed silent was simple and ugly. Someone inside that house had arranged the sale. A noble named Lord Threxel, a man who had once shaken my hand and called me a loyal servant of the crown, had orchestrated the entire ambush to remove Valoran from the line of succession and claim power for himself. The official story being prepared for the public was that the princess had died in a tragic accident. Grief would be performed, mourning would be staged, and a criminal purchase of a living woman would be buried under layers of political convenience. I sat alone in that scrapyard station with a cracked terminal screen glowing in front of me, and something inside me went very quiet and very still. Not sadness, not the kind that makes you weep. This was colder than that. This was the kind of stillness that comes right before a person decides they are no longer willing to accept the world as it has been explained to them. I remembered a promise I had made to King Soravan on the day I was hired. A promise he had probably forgotten the moment I walked out of his throne room, spoken more out of formality than expectation. He had looked at me, a human bodyguard hired mostly because humans were considered expendable and loyal in equal measure, cheap insurance for a royal life that mattered more than mine ever would in the eyes of his court. He had said, "Protect her as if she were your own blood," and I had said, "I will," without truly understanding what those words would eventually cost me. I understood now. There was something else too, something I had never said out loud to anyone, not even to myself in the quiet hours of the night. Somewhere between the long watches and the shared silences, between the moments she trusted me with thoughts she shared with no one else in her court, I had stopped seeing her as a job. I had started seeing her as someone I wanted to know for the rest of my life, whatever that life turned out to look like. I never told her. I never got the chance. And now the thought of her sitting in some warlord's compound, treated as property, as a prize to be displayed and controlled, burned through every cell in my body like fire through dry grass. Owen Marsh found me still sitting at that terminal hours later, my knuckles bruised from where I had struck the console in frustration more than once. He asked me what I planned to do with the information I had found, probably expecting me to say I would report it to the authorities, or move on, or accept that a single human with no army and no resources stood no chance against a royal conspiracy and a warlord who commanded 3 sectors of armed space. I looked at him and said the only thing that felt true. I am going to bring her home, and I am going to make every single person responsible for this regret they ever thought a human bodyguard was expendable. Owen laughed at first, the kind of laugh that comes from disbelief rather than humor, but it faded fast when he saw my face did not change. He had seen a lot of desperate men pass through his scrapyard over the years, men who talked about revenge and justice and grand plans that evaporated the moment reality set in. He told me later that what convinced him I was different was not what I said. It was that I never raised my voice once while saying it. I had no ship. I had no weapons beyond what I could scavenge. I had no allies, no funding, no official standing, and no idea how deep the conspiracy against Valoran actually ran. What I had was a location, a name, and a promise I intended to keep no matter what it cost me. Somewhere across 3 sectors of hostile space, a princess, who had once trusted me to keep her safe, was now living as another man's property, believed dead by the very people who should have been searching for her. She did not know I was alive. She did not know anyone was coming. But I was. I spent that first night in the scrapyard station going through every scrap of salvage Owen had, piecing together a plan that had no business working, powered by nothing but stubbornness and a debt I intended to collect in full. Somewhere out there, Gorath Vex thought he had purchased a quiet prize with no one left alive to object. Somewhere out there, Lord Threxel thought his crime had been buried under a false story of grief and tragedy. They were about to learn that they had made one very serious mistake. They had assumed a human life was worth nothing. They were about to find out exactly how wrong that assumption was. The war for Valoran's freedom had not officially begun yet, not in any way the galaxy would recognize. There was no army marching, no fleet forming, no declaration made, But in that broken scrapyard station, surrounded by dead ships and forgotten wreckage, one man had already decided the outcome, and nothing short of death was going to change his mind. I closed my eyes that night for the first time since waking from unconsciousness, and instead of pain, I felt something closer to purpose. Somewhere far away, under different stars, she was still breathing. That was enough. That was everything I needed. Tomorrow the search would begin. Tomorrow I would start turning myself into something the galaxy had never accounted for. Not a bodyguard anymore. Not a hired hand paid to stand in doorways and take the first hit. Something else entirely. The scrapyard's old systems hummed quietly around me as sleep finally pulled me under, and the last thought I had before the darkness took me was simple, and sharp, and absolutely unshakable. Hold on, Valoran, I am coming. And I am not coming alone for long. Word spreads slowly in the underworld, but it spreads with weight, and within a week of my decision, the first threads of that weight began to move. I started where every desperate man with no resources starts, in the places official records refuse to look. Slave auction records were not filed with any government registry. They existed in shadow ledgers, kept by brokers who trusted no one and answered to even fewer people, hidden behind layers of encryption designed to protect criminals from the consequences of their trade. Getting access to those ledgers meant convincing someone inside that world that I was worth the risk of talking to. Owen Marsh gave me my first real lead, though he did not offer it easily. He had once done business with a woman named Ivy Sutter, a former Ithkari intelligence operative who had fallen out of favor with the royal court years earlier, under circumstances nobody liked to discuss openly. She had settled into the underworld as an information broker, trading secrets for currency and favors, and she had a reputation for knowing which slave auctions moved through which corridors of space, and who bought what, and for how much. Finding her took 2 weeks. Convincing her to help took considerably longer. She met me in a dim cargo bar on a station that did not officially exist on any navigational chart, the kind of place built specifically so people could disappear if they needed to. She studied me for a long time before speaking, her sharp eyes running over every scar and bruise still healing on my face, cataloging me the way a soldier studies terrain before deciding whether it is worth crossing. "You are the human bodyguard," she finally said. "The one who was supposed to die protecting her." "I did not die," I answered. "No," she said. "You did not. That is either very lucky or very foolish. I have not decided which yet." I told her everything. The ambush, the betrayal, Lord Threxul's arrangement with the slave network, Gorath Vex's purchase of the princess, the fabricated story of her death being prepared for the public. Ivy listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking again. "Do you understand what you are asking me to help you do?" she said. "Gorath Vex commands 3 sectors of armed territory. He has private fleets, private armies, and enough political protection that even the systems that despise him look the other way because removing him would cost more than tolerating him. Lord Threxul sits inside the royal court itself, protected by law and title. You are one human with no ship, no weapons, and no allies, and you intend to take both of them down." "I intend to bring her home," I said. "Everything else is just obstacles standing in the way of that." She studied me again, longer this time, and something in her expression shifted, softened slightly at the edges in a way I would not fully understand until much later, when she finally told me her own history with the royal court and why she had left it behind. For now, all she said was this: "I lost everything I had when I chose to stand against people more powerful than me. I have spent years telling myself it was not worth it. But I do not think you are asking because you believe you can win. I think you are asking because you have already decided it does not matter whether you can win. You are going regardless." "That is correct," I said. "Then I suppose I have nothing left to lose by helping a fool," she said, and for the first time since I had met her, something close to a smile crossed her face. Ivy became the second piece of what would eventually grow into something larger than either of us expected. She had access to old intelligence networks, contacts scattered across a dozen systems, and most importantly, she understood how the criminal economy of the slave trade actually functioned, which meant she understood exactly where its weaknesses were. Our first real target was a man named Corell Vance, a slave processor who worked several sectors away, responsible for cataloging and transporting captives before they ever reached auction. Ivy explained that processors like him kept detailed records, not out of any moral obligation, but because the trade required accountability between criminals who trusted no one. If Valoran had passed through his hands before reaching Gorath Vex, his records would tell us exactly how she was transported, what security measures guarded her, and how deeply the operation that took her actually ran. Getting to him meant getting through his operation first, and that was where I learned just how far I was willing to go, and just how much the galaxy underestimated what a single desperate human could accomplish. We assembled what could loosely be called a crew, though at the time it consisted of exactly 4 people and 1 aging transport ship that Owen Marsh sold me at a price so low it was practically a gift, though he insisted afterward that it was simply bad business rather than charity. Owen came along as our pilot, a decision that surprised even him, though he explained it simply by saying that a man who scavenges wreckage for a living eventually gets tired of watching from a distance while the galaxy falls apart around him. Ivy came as our intelligence and negotiator, the one who understood the players and the politics well enough to keep us from walking blindly into traps. And through a contact of Ivy's, we found a 4th member, an exiled Ithkari duelist named Vren Kolash, a man who had once served the royal military before being cast out for reasons he refused to discuss, carrying with him both a deadly skill with a blade and a quiet fury that matched my own. None of us fully trusted each other in those early days. We were bound together by circumstance rather than loyalty, 4 strangers, with different reasons for hating the same enemies. But circumstance has a way of forging something stronger than it initially appears, and within weeks, strangers had become something closer to a team. Our approach to Corell Vance's processing station was careful and quiet, built entirely on information Ivy had gathered about shift changes, security rotations, and the layout of the facility itself. I will not pretend the operation went smoothly. It nearly fell apart twice, once when a guard rotation changed earlier than expected, and once when Vren's presence was noticed by a lookout who nearly raised an alarm before Ivy managed to redirect suspicion elsewhere with nothing but quick thinking and a convincing lie. When we finally reached Corell Vance himself, sitting behind a desk in an office that smelled of recycled air and old currency, he looked at me with the particular confusion of a man who has never once considered that his actions might have consequences. "A human," he said, staring at me like I was some kind of anomaly he needed to categorize. I did not think humans had the resources to reach this far out. "We do not," I told him. "What we have is a reason, and reasons tend to matter more than resources when the person holding them refuses to stop." He gave us the records eventually, though it took more persuasion than I am proud to admit, persuasion built on the simple fact that Corell Vance valued his own continued existence far more than he valued protecting the operation that employed him. What we learned from those records changed everything. Valoran had indeed passed through his facility months earlier, catalogued and transported alongside dozens of other captives, but the records also revealed something Ivy had not expected. Gorath Vex's purchase of the princess had not been a random acquisition made by a warlord looking to expand his collection of valuable captives. It had been arranged in advance, negotiated directly through intermediaries connected to Lord Threxul himself. The ambush had never been about simple political removal. It had been a coordinated transaction from the very beginning, planned with a warlord waiting on the other end to receive exactly what Threxul intended to sell. Valoran had been purchased before she was ever taken, her fate decided in some quiet meeting between 2 men who saw her as nothing more than currency to be exchanged for power. That knowledge settled into my chest like a stone, heavy and cold, but it also clarified something important. This was not simply a rescue mission anymore. This was a conspiracy that ran through the highest levels of the royal court itself, and rescuing Valoran, without addressing that conspiracy, would only leave her vulnerable to whoever came next. Word of what happened at Corel Vance's facility spread faster than I expected through the underworld's quiet channels. Slave processors began speaking of a human who had walked into a secured operation with nothing but 3 companions and left with information no outsider should have been able to obtain. Some called it luck. Others, the ones who had actually seen the look in my eyes during that confrontation, called it something else entirely. I began hearing a name attached to the stories, one that had not existed a month earlier and now traveled ahead of me through the underworld like a warning. The human who does not stop. I did not choose that name. It found me, built from actions rather than intention, and I did not correct anyone who used it. If a reputation could open doors that a single unknown human never could, I intended to let that reputation grow exactly as large as it needed to become. Ivy warned me that reputations cut both directions. The more attention I attracted, the more likely it became that Gorath Vex or Lord Threxul would hear whispers of a human gathering information about their operation, and once they heard those whispers, they would take steps to protect themselves. I understood the risk. I accepted it anyway, because the alternative was moving slowly and carefully while Valoran remained a captive for months longer than necessary, and I was no longer willing to accept that kind of patience. Our next steps took us deeper into the underworld's hidden economy, following the trail of currency and influence that connected Lord Threxul's court contacts to Gorath Vex's private empire. We recruited allies where we could find them, mercenary crews who despised the warlord for reasons of their own, smugglers who resented how his private fleets controlled trade routes they once profited from freely, informants inside his organization who had personal grievances against him that had nothing to do with morality and everything to do with old debts and betrayals. Vren proved invaluable during this period, his knowledge of Ithkari military protocols and combat training giving us an edge whenever confrontations turned physical. He rarely spoke of his own past, but I noticed the particular intensity with which he approached any operation connected to the royal court, and I began to suspect his exile carried a story not entirely unlike my own, a story of loyalty betrayed by the very people it had been offered to. Owen, for his part, transformed our salvage transport into something more capable than its appearance suggested, spending long hours in the engine bay, making modifications that stretched the boundaries of what the ship was originally designed to do. He never spoke of grand purpose the way the rest of us did. He simply worked, quiet and steady, the kind of man who found meaning in usefulness rather than declarations. And through it all, Ivy kept us alive, her instincts for danger sharper than anyone else's on the crew, her network of contacts growing wider with every operation we completed. She began to trust me during this period in ways she had not initially, sharing details of her own history she had kept hidden during our first meeting. She had been cast out of the Royal Intelligence Service years earlier for uncovering corruption within the court, corruption that had gone unpunished while she paid the price for exposing it. Lord Threxul's name had appeared in her old investigations more than once, buried under layers of plausible deniability that had protected him then and might have protected him still, if not for what was coming. Months passed in this manner, each operation building on the last, each piece of information bringing us closer to a complete picture of the conspiracy that had stolen Valoran from her own life. By the time we finally located confirmed intelligence on Gorath Vex's fortress moon, the place where Valoran was reportedly being held, I was no longer the broken man Owen Marsh had found half buried in wreckage debris. I had become something the galaxy had not accounted for. A human with nothing left to lose, surrounded by allies who had found purpose in a cause that was never originally theirs, moving steadily toward a confrontation that 3 sectors of armed space were not prepared to face. Somewhere on that fortress moon, Valoran was still alive, still waiting, though she did not know for what. Somewhere in the royal court, Lord Threxul continued playing his part in the false story of her death, believing himself untouchable. They were both about to be proven wrong. The fortress moon of Gorath Vex sat in silence when we finally arrived, an artificial calm that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Ivy's intelligence had brought us close enough to begin planning a way inside, but nothing could have fully prepared me for what waited beyond those walls, and nothing could have prepared me for how Valoran would look when I finally saw her again. The facility itself was less a fortress in the traditional sense, and more a sprawling compound built into the moon's natural rock formations, reinforced with layers of shielding technology that made a direct assault impossible for a crew our size. Ivy spent days studying the compound's security patterns, cross-referencing them against information purchased from a disgraced former guard who had been dismissed from Vex's service under circumstances he refused to explain, motivated entirely by resentment rather than any desire to see justice done. What we learned painted a picture darker than I had allowed myself to imagine. Gorath Vex did not simply keep captives locked away in cells, hidden from view and forgotten. He displayed them. Valoran, as the crown jewel of his most recent acquisitions, had been forced into a role designed specifically to humiliate her people. Presented during court gatherings as a tamed princess, dressed in ceremonial garments stripped of their original meaning, made to perform gestures of submission in front of guests who found entertainment in watching a once powerful royal reduced to spectacle. The informant who described this to us did so with a casual detachment that made my hands curl into fists beneath the table, and I had to remind myself repeatedly that losing control now would accomplish nothing except getting all of us killed before we ever reached her. Vren noticed my reaction and said something quietly afterward that stayed with me through everything that followed. He told me that anger given direction becomes purpose, but anger without direction only destroys the person carrying it. I did not fully understand what he meant until later, when the moment came to actually walk into that compound and see her with my own eyes. Getting inside required patience I did not naturally possess, but had learned to fake convincingly over the previous months. Ivy arranged for our entry through a contact who worked as a supply logistics coordinator within the compound, a woman motivated by a private grudge against Vex that she never fully explained and that Ivy never pressed her to reveal. Some alliances in the underworld are built on shared goals. Others are built simply on shared enemies, and in this case, that was enough. We entered disguised as part of a supply delivery, a slow and careful infiltration that required every ounce of discipline the crew had developed over months of operations together. Vren moved through the corridors with a controlled stillness that made him nearly invisible despite his size, while Owen remained behind with the ship, ready for extraction the moment we needed it. Ivy guided us through the compound's layout from memory, having memorized every schematic detail available to her, correcting our path whenever patrols shifted unexpectedly. I saw Valoran for the first time in the compound's central gathering hall, and the sight of her stopped me completely, froze every plan and every carefully rehearsed strategy in my mind at once. She was thinner than I remembered, her posture held with a rigid control that I recognized immediately as survival rather than composure. The silver eyes that had once studied court politics with sharp intelligence now moved carefully across the room, cataloging threats and exits with the same instinctive caution I had taught her myself during the early days of my service, back when I trained her in basic self-protection despite objections from courtiers who insisted a princess needed no such skills. She was seated near the center of the hall, dressed in garments that were clearly meant to symbolize her captured status, and though I could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face, I could also see something else beneath it, something that had not been broken despite everything done to try and break it. Defiance. Quiet, controlled, and entirely her own. Getting close enough to speak to her without alerting the guards required nearly an hour of careful movement, using Ivy's knowledge of shift patterns to slip through moments of reduced attention. When I finally stood near enough to speak in a voice too quiet for anyone else to hear, I realized I had spent months imagining this moment and had never once decided what I would actually say. "Valoran," I said. She turned slowly, and for a long moment, Her expression showed nothing but confusion, the careful blankness of someone who had trained herself not to react visibly to anything in this place. Then recognition broke through, and her eyes widened in a way that made my chest ache with an intensity I had not expected. "You are dead," she whispered. "They told me you died protecting me. They told everyone I died in an accident. Both stories were convenient lies," I told her. "I am very much alive, and you are coming home." She studied my face for a long moment, and I understood then how much had changed for both of us. The man standing in front of her was not the same bodyguard who had once stood quietly in doorways, following orders and maintaining professional distance. Months of desperation and purpose had hardened something in me, and I could see her recognizing that change, weighing it against the memory of who I had been. "You look different," she said quietly. "I have had to become different," I answered. "There was no other way to reach you." We did not have time for a longer reunion. A guard rotation shifted earlier than Ivy's intelligence had predicted, and within moments, the careful infiltration we had planned began collapsing into something far more dangerous. Vren moved first, intercepting a guard before an alarm could be raised, while Ivy worked desperately to disable a nearby security terminal before it could alert the wider compound. "I want you to understand something clearly," I told Valoran, as chaos began erupting around us. "I am not simply here to steal you away quietly and disappear. What was done to you was not an accident, and it was not the action of one warlord acting alone. Lord Threxul arranged this. He sold you for power, and he has spent months telling your own people that you are dead, so no one would ever come looking." Her expression shifted from shock to something colder, something that reminded me exactly why she had been raised to eventually rule. "Then quietly disappearing is not enough," she said. "If what you say is true, running will only let him continue exactly as he intended." "I agree," I told her, "which is why I have spent months building something larger than a single rescue attempt." The alarm finally sounded throughout the compound, and whatever quiet infiltration we had managed collapsed entirely into open confrontation. Guards flooded the central hall from multiple directions, and I found myself standing beside Valoran for the first time in months, fighting not as her protector standing between her and danger, but as an equal standing beside someone who had never truly needed saving so much as she needed someone willing to fight alongside her. Vren cut through the compound's defenses with brutal efficiency, his exile from the royal military clearly having done nothing to diminish his skill, while Ivy worked frantically to secure an escape route, rerouting security systems and disabling automated defenses through a combination of technical skill and desperate improvisation. I fought beside Valoran through corridors I had never seen before, guided only by Ivy's voice through a comlink, every step forward contested by guards who had clearly never expected their fortress moon to face this kind of direct assault. Gorath Vex himself appeared during the final stretch of our escape, emerging from a private chamber with an expression of genuine surprise rather than fear, the look of a man who had never once considered that anyone would be foolish enough to challenge him directly within his own stronghold. "A human," he said, studying me with something between amusement and disbelief. "I did not think your species had the audacity for something like this." "You purchased a person," I told him, "not a possession, and people have a way of proving audacious when someone they care about is taken from them." We did not have time for a longer confrontation, and I made the deliberate choice not to pursue one, recognizing that our priority remained getting Valoran safely out of the compound rather than settling scores in a moment that favored his forces far more than ours. We reached the extraction point where Owen waited with the ship's engines already primed, and within minutes we were breaking away from the Fortress Moon's gravity well, while defense ships scrambled behind us in disorganized pursuit that Owen's modified engines easily outran. Valoran sat in silence for much of the initial escape, processing the reality of freedom after months of captivity, and I found myself sitting beside her without quite knowing what to say, the weight of everything unspoken between us finally having space to exist without immediate danger crowding it out. "I thought about you every day," she finally said, breaking the silence. I told myself it did not matter, because you were gone, and thinking about it changed nothing. But it mattered anyway. It mattered to me too, I told her, and something in the way she looked at me afterward told me she understood exactly what I meant, even though neither of us said the words directly yet. But freedom was not the end of what needed to happen, and both of us knew it. Goreth Vex remained a warlord commanding 3 sectors of armed territory, now personally insulted and humiliated by what had happened within his own fortress. Lord Threxul remained hidden within the royal court, protected by a fabricated story of tragedy that would collapse the moment Valoran's survival became known. What we had accomplished was not an ending, it was the spark that would ignite everything still to come, and as our ship carried us away from the fortress moon into open space, I understood that the true war, the one that would determine not just Valoran's freedom, but the future of how humanity itself was regarded across the galaxy, had only just begun. The days following our escape from Goreth Vex's fortress moon were unlike anything I had prepared myself for, because freedom, it turned out, was far more complicated than simple rescue. Valoran's survival could not remain hidden for long. Not once Goreth Vex realized exactly who had slipped through his defenses and understood the political weight of what had happened. A humiliated warlord with wounded pride was a dangerous thing, and within days, Ivy's contacts reported that Vex had begun quietly reaching out to allies across his 3 sectors, calling in favors and preparing forces, not merely to recapture Valoran, but to make an example of anyone who had dared challenge him directly within his own stronghold. At the same time, word of the princess's survival was beginning to spread through channels that Lord Threxul could not control, threatening to unravel months of carefully constructed lies about her death. Ivy warned that once Threxul understood his conspiracy was at risk of exposure, he would move quickly and decisively to protect himself, likely reaching out to Goreth Vex to coordinate a combined response that neither of us could survive without significant support. We needed allies, and we needed them quickly, which meant the quiet, careful approach that had defined our operations until now had to change into something far larger and far more public. Valoran insisted on being part of every strategic discussion that followed, refusing the role of passive rescued royalty that I suspect some part of her expected me to offer. She spoke with a clarity and determination that reminded me exactly why her father had once been so protective of her potential to rule, outlining exactly which noble houses within the Ithkari court might be sympathetic to exposing Threxul's betrayal, and which underworld factions across the 3 contested sectors held long-standing grievances against Goreth Vex that could be turned into active support. "This is not simply about rescuing me anymore," she said during one of our planning sessions aboard the ship. "This is about exposing a conspiracy that reaches into the highest levels of my own government, and confronting a warlord who has ruled through fear for far too long. If we do this quietly, we will spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, waiting for the next attempt. We need to end this permanently." I agreed with her completely, though I understood the scale of what she was suggesting meant moving far beyond anything our small crew could accomplish alone. Ivy's network proved more valuable than I had ever fully appreciated during this period, her years of underworld connections finally paying dividends beyond simple information gathering. She began reaching out to mercenary crews who had clashed with Vex's forces over territory disputes, smugglers who resented how his private fleets restricted trade routes they once profited from freely, and disgraced noble houses within the Ithkari court who had their own reasons to despise Lord Threxul's rising influence. What surprised me most during this period was how many of these potential allies, upon learning that the operation's central figure was a human bodyguard who had crossed 3 sectors of hostile space for a princess who was not even his own species, became willing to listen in ways they might not have otherwise. My reputation, the human who does not stop, had grown into something that carried genuine weight within certain circles, and I began to understand that the galaxy's assumptions about human capability were shifting, slowly but unmistakably, because of what our small crew had already accomplished. Vren proved instrumental in reaching out to his old military contacts, soldiers who had served alongside him before his exile and who still respected his skill even if the royal court had cast him aside. Several of these contacts, disillusioned with a system that had discarded a soldier of Vren's caliber over political disagreements rather than any actual wrongdoing, agreed to lend their expertise and connections to our growing effort. Owen, meanwhile, focused on something equally important, gathering human mercenary crews scattered across various systems who had grown tired of being treated as expendable labor by alien powers who saw humanity as little more than cheap muscle for hire. He explained to me one evening, while working on the ship's engines, that humans across the galaxy had spent generations accepting a diminished status because no one had ever given them a reason to believe otherwise. No cause large enough to unite scattered individuals into something resembling collective strength. You gave them that reason, he told me, whether you meant to or not. Within weeks, what had begun as a desperate rescue operation involving 4 people had grown into a genuine coalition. Human mercenary crews who had spent years accepting whatever contracts alien employers offered them, regardless of danger or dignity, began arriving in small groups, drawn by stories of a human who had walked into a warlord's fortress and walked out with a princess. Disgraced Ithkari noble houses, resentful of Lord Threxul's growing influence within the royal court, offered quiet support in the form of resources and intelligence, unwilling to act openly but eager to see Threxul's conspiracy exposed by someone else's hand. Even certain criminal factions who despised Gorath Vex more than they despised the idea of cooperating with law-abiding forces began offering assistance, motivated entirely by old grievances rather than any newfound moral conviction. It was Valorin who suggested the strategy that would ultimately define our approach to the coming confrontation. Rather than attempting a quiet, covert strike against either Vex or Threxul individually, she proposed exposing the conspiracy publicly and simultaneously, forcing both men to face consequences in the full view of the galaxy, rather than allowing either of them to quietly eliminate the threat through backroom maneuvering. If we strike quietly, she explained, they can control the narrative afterward, painting us as criminals or extremists. But if the truth comes out publicly, supported by evidence and witnessed by enough people, they will have no way to bury it again. The plan that emerged from these discussions was ambitious beyond anything I had originally imagined when I first woke up in Owen's scrapyard station with nothing but a promise and a broken body. We would coordinate a 2-pronged assault, striking Gorath Vex's Fortress Moon directly with our growing coalition of allies, while simultaneously releasing evidence of Lord Threxul's conspiracy to every major information network across Ithkari-controlled space, timed precisely so that neither man would have the opportunity to coordinate a unified response before the truth became impossible to suppress. Ivy spent considerable effort compiling evidence that would withstand public scrutiny, cross-referencing financial records, communication intercepts, and testimony from those willing to speak against Threxul now that Valorin's survival gave them a reason to believe justice might actually be possible. It was delicate, dangerous work, and more than once during this period, I worried that our expanding operation had grown too large to remain secret for much longer, that Vex or Threxul would learn of our plans before we were ready to act. Those fears were not unfounded. Roughly 3 weeks into our preparations, Ivy intercepted communications, suggesting that Gorath Vex had indeed begun coordinating directly with Lord Threxul, both men finally understanding that their individual survival depended on eliminating the threat we represented before it could grow any larger. This acceleration forced our hand, compressing what should have been months of careful preparation into a matter of days. Valorin handled this pressure with a composure that continued to remind me of exactly who she truly was, beneath months of forced captivity. During one of our final planning sessions before the assault, she found me alone on the ship's observation deck, staring out at the stars while running through strategic contingencies in my mind. "You have changed everything," she said, joining me at the viewport. "Not just for me. For every human who has ever been told they were not capable of more than what others expected of them." I did not do this alone, I told her. I could not have done any of this without people who chose to believe in something larger than themselves. Perhaps, she said, but it began with you refusing to accept that my life was not worth the fight. That refusal has become something much larger now, something that will change how this entire galaxy views your people, whether you intended that outcome or not. I did not have a response to that immediately, because I had never set out to prove anything about humanity as a whole. I had simply refused to abandon someone I cared about, and everything that followed had grown organically from that single, stubborn decision. But listening to her speak, I understood that intentions did not always determine outcomes, and sometimes the most personal motivations produced consequences far larger than anything originally imagined. As our coalition finalized preparations for the assault on Gorath Vex's fortress moon, I found myself reflecting on how far we had come from that scrapyard station where this entire journey began. What started as one broken man's desperate promise had grown into a movement that spanned multiple sectors, multiple species, and multiple motivations, all converging toward a single confrontation that would determine not just Valoran's future, but the future of how humanity itself would be regarded across a galaxy that had spent generations underestimating what desperate, determined people were capable of accomplishing. The night before the assault, I found Valoran standing alone near the ship's cargo bay, checking equipment with a focus that told me she was using preparation as a way to manage nerves she would never openly admit to feeling. I joined her without speaking at first, simply standing beside her the way I once had during quieter days of formal duty, though everything about our relationship now carried a weight that title and position had never fully captured. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she finally said, "I need you to know that none of this would have been possible without you. Not the escape, not the alliance we have built, none of it. I am not doing this for recognition," I told her. "I know," she said, turning to look at me directly. "That is exactly why it matters so much. Tomorrow would bring us face to face with Gorath Vex's full military strength, and simultaneously force Lord Threxul to confront a truth he had spent months trying desperately to bury. Neither confrontation would be simple, and neither man would surrender easily. But standing there in the quiet hours before everything changed, surrounded by allies who had chosen to fight for a cause that had begun as one human's personal promise, I understood that whatever came next, we were no longer facing this fight alone. The war that would determine Valoran's fate and reshape how an entire galaxy understood humanity's true capabilities was about to begin in earnest. The assault on Gorath Vex's fortress moon began not with the quiet infiltration of our earlier operations, but with something far larger and impossible to hide. Our coalition had grown into a genuine fighting force by the time we approached the moon's outer defenses, a combination of human mercenary crews who had answered Owen's call, disgraced Ithkari military veterans loyal to Vren, and criminal factions motivated by old grievances against a warlord who had ruled through fear for far too long. I stood on the bridge of our lead ship as the fortress moon grew larger on the view screen, watching defense systems begin activating in response to what Vex's forces clearly recognized as an organized invasion rather than another failed infiltration attempt. Valoran stood beside me, dressed now in combat gear rather than the ceremonial garments that had once symbolized her captivity, her posture radiating a determination that reminded everyone present exactly why she had been raised to eventually rule an empire. "This is not just for me anymore," she said quietly, watching the fortress defenses power up in the distance. "This is for every person he has ever purchased and displayed like property. Today, that ends." The battle that followed tested everything our coalition had built over the previous weeks. Vex's forces were larger and better equipped than our combined coalition, a fact that would have made this confrontation impossible for any conventional military strategy. But our advantage was never numbers or equipment. It was the same unpredictable resourcefulness that had defined every operation since I first walked into Corel Vance's processing facility months earlier, a willingness to adapt and improvise that Vex's rigid military hierarchy simply could not match. Human mercenary crews, dismissed for generations as expendable labor, unsuited for genuine strategic thinking, proved themselves capable of tactics that caught Vex's forces completely off guard. Rather than engaging his defense fleet in conventional formation, our human pilots scattered into unpredictable patterns that Owen had helped design, drawing on generations of asymmetric combat experience that alien military doctrines had never fully accounted for because they had never taken human strategic thinking seriously enough to study it properly. I led the boarding action personally, cutting through the Fortress Moon's compromised outer defenses alongside Vren and a small strike team drawn from our most capable allies. The compound's interior, once a place designed to display captives as spectacle for Vex's amusement, became a battleground where months of careful planning finally converged into direct confrontation. We fought through corridor after corridor, facing resistance that grew more desperate as Vex's forces realized their fortress was genuinely at risk of falling. I will not pretend the fighting was easy or without cost. Allies who had joined our cause were injured, some seriously, and the weight of responsibility for every person who had chosen to fight alongside me settled heavily on my shoulders throughout the entire assault. But something remarkable happened as the battle progressed. Word began spreading through the compound, whispered between guards and staff who had themselves been treated poorly under Vex's rule, that a human-led coalition was systematically dismantling his forces from within. Some of his own staff, people who had witnessed the cruelty of his regime firsthand, began quietly refusing to fight, unwilling to risk their lives defending a man who had never once shown them genuine loyalty in return. By the time I reached the Fortress Moon's central command chamber, Goreth Vex's forces had been significantly weakened, not merely by our direct assault, but by the erosion of loyalty from within his own ranks. He stood waiting for me when I finally broke through the chamber's final defenses, flanked by only a handful of his most loyal guards. His earlier amusement at facing a human challenger now replaced by genuine concern. "You should not have been capable of this," he said, studying the chaos visible through the chamber's viewport, where our coalition forces continued securing control of the Fortress Moon's remaining defenses. "You should not have assumed we were incapable," I answered. The confrontation that followed was brief but decisive, and I will spare the details of exactly how it concluded, except to say that Gorath Vex's 3 sectors of controlled territory would no longer answer to a warlord who ruled through cruelty and fear. His forces, seeing their leader defeated and abandoned by many of his own staff, surrendered rather than continuing a fight that had already been lost. But securing the Fortress Moon was only half of what needed to happen that day. Simultaneously, across multiple sectors of Ithkari-controlled space, Ivy executed the second phase of our plan, releasing carefully compiled evidence of Lord Threxul's conspiracy to every major information network she could access. Financial records connecting him directly to the slave network that had purchased Valoran. Communication intercepts proving he had orchestrated the original ambush. Testimony from witnesses who had remained silent out of fear until Valoran's survival gave them reason to believe justice was finally possible. The information spread through Ithkari society with a speed that even Ivy had not fully anticipated, fueled by a public that had spent months mourning a princess they believed dead, now confronted with proof that her death had been an elaborate lie constructed to hide a betrayal from within their own royal court. Public outrage grew swiftly, and within hours, noble houses that had previously remained silent out of fear of Threxul's influence began publicly condemning him, eager to distance themselves from a conspiracy that threatened to implicate anyone who had failed to question the official story of Valoran's death. Lord Threxul attempted to flee the royal court once the evidence became public, but Ithkari security forces, no longer bound by loyalty to a man exposed as a traitor and slaver, apprehended him before he could escape into hiding. The conspiracy that had begun with a betrayed convoy and a stolen princess finally collapsed entirely, exposed to a galaxy that had spent months believing a carefully constructed lie. Word of both victories, the fall of Gorath Vex's fortress Moon, and the exposure of Lord Threxul's conspiracy spread rapidly across the sectors, carried by news networks eager to report on a story that had captured public attention throughout the crisis. And embedded within every version of that story was the same central detail that no one could avoid discussing. A human bodyguard, dismissed by the very system he served as expendable hired muscle, had refused to accept his princess's fate, had built a coalition from nothing, and had ultimately succeeded where an entire royal court had failed to act. I did not fully understand the scale of what we had accomplished until I stood in the Fortress Moon's central chamber hours later, watching our coalition secure the compound and begin the process of freeing other captives who had been held there under conditions similar to what Valoran had endured. Human mercenaries who had spent their entire careers being treated as disposable labor now stood as recognized liberators, their contributions acknowledged publicly by alien allies who had never before considered humanity capable of this kind of decisive, coordinated action. Valoran found me standing near the chamber's viewport, watching the last of Vex's surrendered forces being processed by our coalition's security teams. She looked different than she had during our earlier reunion in that hall of humiliation, standing taller now, the exhaustion of captivity replaced by something closer to the confident bearing I remembered from before the ambush that had started everything. "It is over," she said, though her tone carried more disbelief than certainty, as though she still needed to hear the words spoken aloud to fully accept them as true. "The immediate threat is over," I corrected gently. "But what comes after this will determine whether everything we fought for actually means something lasting." She nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. Gorath Vex's fall would create a power vacuum across 3 sectors that would need careful management to prevent new conflicts from emerging in his absence. Lord Threxul's exposure would trigger significant upheaval within the royal court, upheaval that could either lead to meaningful reform or simply create opportunities for other ambitious nobles to seize power through equally corrupt means. But for the first time since this entire journey began in a broken scrapyard station months earlier, I allowed myself to feel something other than desperate determination. I felt something closer to hope, the recognition that impossible odds had been overcome, not through the actions of one person alone, but through a coalition built from shared purpose, proving that strength did not always come from the resources a person started with, but from the willingness to keep moving forward, regardless of how impossible the odds initially appeared. Valoran was free. Gorath Vex's cruelty had been ended. Lord Threxul's betrayal had been exposed to a galaxy that would no longer allow it to remain hidden. And humanity, dismissed for generations as little more than useful labor for alien powers who never bothered to consider what determined, desperate people were truly capable of accomplishing, had proven itself in a way that would echo across the sectors for years to come. But even as I stood there processing everything we had achieved, I understood that our journey was not yet fully complete. There remained the matter of returning Valoran to her rightful place within the royal court, navigating the political upheaval that would inevitably follow Threxul's exposure, and determining what future, if any, existed for a human bodyguard who had become something far more significant than his original position had ever intended him to be. That future remained uncertain, but for the first time in months, uncertainty no longer felt like something to fear. It felt like possibility. The journey back to the Ithkari royal court felt entirely different from the desperate, uncertain path that had brought us to Gorath Vex's Fortress Moon. Where our approach to that confrontation had been shrouded in secrecy and careful planning, our return home carried the weight of public attention, every step now witnessed by a galaxy, eager to see how this story would finally conclude. Lord Threxul's trial began within days of our return, conducted publicly in a manner the royal court rarely allowed for matters involving nobility, a decision made necessary by the sheer scale of public outrage that had followed the exposure of his conspiracy. I attended alongside Valoran, watching as evidence Ivy had compiled was presented before judges who had once considered Threxul an untouchable pillar of the court's power structure. He showed no remorse during the proceedings, maintaining until the very end that his actions had been justified by political necessity, that Valoran's removal from the line of succession had been required to prevent what he called dangerous instability within the empire. His arguments found no sympathy among judges who had seen the evidence of his betrayal laid bare, evidence that included not just his arrangement of the original ambush, but the callous ease with which he had sold a living person into captivity and then constructed months of false mourning to hide his crime. The verdict, when it finally came, stripped Threxul of his title, his lands, and his standing within Ithkari society, sentencing him to permanent exile from the empire he had once served. It was not the violent justice that some among our coalition had expected, or perhaps even wanted, but Valoran insisted throughout the proceedings that the Ithkari justice system needed to demonstrate it could hold even its most powerful members accountable through legitimate process rather than through the same kind of unchecked violence that had defined Threxul's own actions. Justice that abandons its own principles the moment convenience demands, it is not justice at all, she told me one evening as the trial concluded. If we want this empire to actually change, we need to prove that change is possible through the systems meant to protect people, not simply through force alone. I understood her reasoning, though part of me, the part shaped by months of desperate fighting and impossible odds, still felt a flicker of frustration that a man responsible for so much suffering would walk away with his life intact. But watching Valoran navigate these proceedings with the same quiet strength she had shown throughout our entire ordeal, I recognized that this was exactly the kind of leadership her people needed, someone capable of channeling anger into meaningful reform rather than simply perpetuating cycles of retribution. King Soravan, upon learning the full truth of what had happened to his daughter and the depth of Threxul's betrayal, publicly acknowledged the debt his family owed to me and to every member of our coalition who had risked everything to bring her home safely. He offered formal recognition, titles, resources, whatever compensation seemed appropriate for a debt that words alone could never fully repay. I found myself, during a private audience with him, weeks after the trial's conclusion, reflecting on the promise I had made to him so long ago, back when I was hired as little more than expendable insurance for his daughter's safety. He remembered that conversation clearly, and something in his expression suggested genuine shame at how little weight he had originally placed on those words. "I told you to protect her, as if she were your own blood," he said. "I said those words expecting nothing more than professional duty in return. I did not expect a promise that would move an entire galaxy." "Neither did I admitted honestly. "Some promises grow into something larger than we originally intend them to be." Our coalition, meanwhile, began the difficult process of adjusting to a world reshaped by everything we had accomplished together. Human mercenary crews who had joined our cause found themselves treated with newfound respect across multiple sectors, their reputation transformed from expendable hired muscle into recognized allies capable of decisive strategic action. Owen used this shifting perception to establish legitimate contracts and partnerships that would have been unimaginable before our campaign against Goreth Vex, finally receiving recognition for skills that alien employers had spent years dismissing without proper consideration. Ivy returned to a position of respect within Ithkari intelligence circles that had once cast her aside, her years of exile finally vindicated by the crucial role she had played in exposing Threxul's conspiracy. She never fully rejoined the formal structures of the royal court, preferring the independence her underworld connections had taught her to value, but the respect she now commanded within those same circles was undeniable and well-earned. Vren remained closer to Valoran's side during this period than any of us, his military expertise proving valuable as the Empire worked to stabilize the power vacuum left by Goreth Vex's fall across 3 previously contested sectors. His exile, once a source of quiet bitterness, transformed into something closer to redemption, his skills finally recognized by an empire that had once cast him aside for reasons that seemed increasingly petty in light of everything he had accomplished during our campaign. As for myself, I found the transition from desperate rescuer to recognized figure within Ithkari society more complicated than I had anticipated. The reputation that had followed me throughout our campaign, the human who does not stop, continued to grow even after our immediate objectives had been accomplished, carrying with it expectations and attention I had never sought but could no longer avoid. Valoran and I spent considerable time together during this period of transition, our relationship evolving naturally from the desperate urgency of rescue into something quieter and more deliberate, built on the foundation of everything we had endured together. The conversations we shared during quiet evenings aboard our ship, conversations about home and freedom and what mattered most in life, had grown into something neither of us was willing to leave unspoken any longer. I found her one evening on a balcony overlooking the royal court's gardens, the same gardens where I had once stood formal watch during my early days as her bodyguard, back when professional distance was the only acceptable boundary between us. She turned as I approached, and something in her expression told me she had been waiting, perhaps hoping I would find her there. "I have been offered my position back within the line of succession," she said, formally reinstated, with full recognition of everything Threxel tried to take from me. "That is good news," I said, though I sensed there was more she intended to say. "It is," she agreed, "but accepting that position means accepting responsibilities that will shape the rest of my life, responsibilities that will determine where I live, how I spend my time, who I am able to keep close to me." I understood what she was really asking, even though neither of us had spoken it directly yet. Throughout everything we had endured together, I had never allowed myself to consider what came after Valoran's rescue was complete, focused entirely on the singular goal of bringing her home safely. Now, standing in that garden with our campaign finally concluded, I had to confront a question I had avoided for months. "What do you want?" she finally asked directly, turning to face me fully. "Not what duty demands, not what expectation requires. What do you actually want, Kale?" I thought about Earth, a planet I had not seen in years, filled with memories that had grown distant during months of desperate campaign across hostile space. I thought about the reputation I had built, the human who does not stop, and what responsibilities that reputation might eventually demand of me if I chose to remain within Ithkari society. And I thought about everything unspoken between Valoran and myself, feelings that had grown steadily throughout months of shared danger and quiet trust, feelings I had never allowed myself to voice while she remained under my professional protection. "I do not want to simply guard your doorway anymore," I told her honestly. "I spent months learning what it meant to fight beside you rather than simply stand in front of you, and I do not think I can return to the way things were before, watching from a respectful distance while pretending that distance is all I actually want." Her expression shifted, something vulnerable and hopeful crossing features that had learned to guard emotion carefully throughout months of captivity and political maneuvering. "Then what do you want instead?" she asked quietly. "I want to stay," I said, the words finally spoken after months of careful avoidance. "Not as your bodyguard, not out of obligation or professional duty. I want to stay because somewhere during everything we endured together, protecting you stopped being my job and became simply what I wanted to do with my life, regardless of title or position." She closed the distance between us then, and the conversation that followed needed few additional words, communicated instead through the kind of understanding that only develops between people who have faced impossible odds together and emerged transformed by the experience. In the months that followed, Valoran was formally reinstated to her position within the line of succession, her survival and the exposure of Threxel's conspiracy having strengthened rather than diminished her standing among the Ithkari people, who now viewed her not merely as a royal figure, but as someone who had endured genuine hardship and emerged stronger for it. She began implementing reforms within the royal court, designed to prevent future conspiracies like the one that had nearly cost her everything, reforms that drew directly from lessons learned during our campaign about the value of loyalty built on genuine trust rather than political convenience. I remained by her side, though not in the capacity I had originally held. The title of Bodyguard no longer accurately described my role within her life, replaced instead by something that resisted easy categorization within traditional HFY court structures, a partnership built on equal footing rather than formal hierarchy. Humanity's reputation across the sectors continued evolving in the aftermath of our campaign, no longer viewed simply as convenient labor for alien powers who saw no further value in the species beyond expendable service. Human mercenary crews found themselves increasingly sought after for genuine strategic partnerships rather than disposable contract work, while human diplomatic representatives began receiving consideration in negotiations that would have excluded them entirely before our campaign against Goreth Vex demonstrated exactly what human determination and resourcefulness could accomplish when given genuine opportunity. I often thought back to that broken scrapyard station where this entire journey began, to the moment I had made a promise that seemed impossible for a single injured human with no resources to ever fulfill. I thought about how easily that promise could have remained nothing more than desperate words spoken in grief, how many similar promises across the galaxy had likely dissolved into nothing when confronted with genuinely impossible odds. But some promises, when combined with enough stubbornness and enough people willing to believe in a cause larger than themselves, prove capable of reshaping far more than anyone originally intended. I never returned to Earth permanently, though I visited occasionally during the years that followed, carrying with me stories that reshaped how many humans understood their own potential within a galaxy that had spent generations telling them they were less capable than the alien powers who employed them. Valoran eventually ascended to her rightful place, ruling alongside her father, before eventually taking the throne herself, implementing changes that strengthened relationships between the HFY Empire and human communities scattered across previously dismissive alien territories. And through everything that followed, through political challenges and continued threats that inevitably arise whenever meaningful power shifts occur, I remained beside her, no longer defined by the title of Bodyguard that had first brought us together, but by something far more permanent, built from shared danger, shared determination, and a promise that had grown into something neither of us could have predicted when I first swore to protect her, as if she were my own blood. Home, I eventually understood, was never simply a place I needed to return to. It was wherever the person I had fought so hard to save happened to be standing, and I intended to remain exactly there for as long as she would have me.